I have no apologies. I was a crusader for the development of water. I was the Messiah. I was the evangelist that went out and argued persuasively to develop our rivers and water supplies for the benefit of people.
In the American desert, we have built a great new civilization in less than a century, where none could possibly be in the natural order of things. We have made the land wet where it was dry, and dry where it was wet. We have lifted great rivers out of their ancient beds and moved them over half a continent. Our great cities stand in a desert that is drier than the plains of North Africa. It would all be impossible without the breathtaking manipulation of water. We fought over water, thrived on water, and finally, we engineered the desert out of existence.
Next to God, there's water.
Everybody is conscious of water. If you head for the river with an empty bucket, you're liable to get shot. So.
Can you imagine today, an American city, acquiring an entire river?
The idea of subduing nature has captivated the whole country. Congress cannot appropriate enough money fast enough to build more dams.
We built the dams for all the right reasons when they were desperately needed, with little thought to the consequences. The developing world watched and envied our success.
The engineering marvel that is Cooley Dam, inspected by Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia.
Supplying water to a population growing that fast is extremely difficult.
It was a little bit like the Sorcerer's Apprentice. You've got to have more water, more water, more water.
They're going to dam this canyon.
There was no end to these people who had plans to dam San Francisco Bay, pipelines beyond your wildest dreams. When this wasn't about carrying oil, this was about carrying water.
We have forgotten that the natural West is barren and fatally dry, and that our new bountiful West is a fragile construction. Here and there are reminders of what happens when the water is turned off, or when the waterworks fail.
Somehow, the water stopped flowing. You'd have a desert again overnight.
The dam's gone.
The whole thing has gone now?
The whole thing is gone. It rolled over about 5 minutes ago.
Okay.
If you can get us any help on radio or whatnot, get the people south of there out.
All right. Where do you want the people evacuated?
Well, we would like to get them off the river in low-lying spots.
Cadillac Desert is brought to you in part by Gap, a proud supporter of programs that address the issues you care about. And by Brita, maker of Brita water filtration systems. Brita makes tap water taste the way nature intended. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the support of viewers like you. Major funding also provided by the Ford Foundation, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, with additional funding from these organizations.
Well, it's 6:22 at 710 Talk KMPC. I'm Dominic with Airwatch Traffic, and I got to tell you, the Jackknife Big Rig in Pasadena has the 210 eastbound in trouble right at Rosemead, where the right 3 lanes are out of commission. The Jackknife Big Rig there, and about a quarter mile slow. On the westbound side, almost across the fence from it, right at Sierra Madre. Right lane is blocked with a car fire, so get ready. It's slow from the 605. And how are things in Orange County? Hey, Scott Forrest, good morning.
18, el Ronald Reagan Freeway al oeste, acercándose a la calle Reseda Boulevard, Monte Vista, accidente de 3 autos.
할리우드 프리웨이로 바뀌는 101번 사우스 방향입니다. 할리우드에서부터 시작해서 다운타운에
Bell Street. It's a car that spun out and hit the center divider, and 2 left lanes are protected by CHP vehicles. Use alternate routes such as Laurel Canyon or even Mulholland today.
I think my grandfather, his vision was a city like Dublin, which was the city of his childhood. And it was a vision, I think, of a 19th century city, where people ambled on streets and knew one another and enjoyed the theater and the opera and the university. A civilized 19th century city.
No other Buick dealership in California has been best in its class for 7 years. That's because no other Buick dealership has sold more than 10,000 Buicks in the last 10 years. The list goes on and on. Right now, we do have lots of traffic to talk about, too. First of all, the KABC traffic alert continues.
The thing that you have to remember about Los Angeles is it never really had a reason to be there. It had no minerals, no metals, no forests. In other words, everything that any major American city used to develop itself, LA lacked. And above all, it lacked water.
Since the beginning of time, this was a place of earthquakes and perpetual drought. First claimed by the Spaniards, and then conquered by the Americans. Virtually everyone here had come from somewhere else. In 1878, William Mulholland arrived from the Green Hills of Ireland. He had stowed away on a sailing ship, worked as a lumberjack, failed as a gold miner, and had walked across Panama to save $25 in train fare. He was fond of one-armed chin-ups and grand opera. Mulholland found work as a ditch digger on the growing town's dilapidated water system.
LA was desperate to become a modern city. It had been a backwater for so many decades. But its water system, on the other hand, was pretty much the same old jerry-built thing. A bunch of old water wheels, a falling apart system.
He worked hard, read Shakespeare and hydraulic engineering late into the night, taught himself to keep the entire LA water system in his head, and climbed through the ranks. In 1886, when his boss suddenly dropped dead, William Mulholland found himself superintendent of the LA water system. The little desert pueblo had grown to 100,000 people, thanks to the Chamber of Commerce and a new railroad. And by 1903, LA had sucked dry the tiny Los Angeles River, its only source of water.
My mother would tell me these stories of growing up without water. 1 bath a week on Saturday night in a big zinc tub that was dragged into the kitchen and water heated. And Papa got the first bath, Mama got the second, and the kids. And Mother told me, and they were not what you'd call white trash, but she told me she never had a bath in pure, clean water. I was raised with a real sense that water was a precious item and not to be squandered.
Superintendent Mulholland tried to make Los Angeles live within its means, but growth sabotaged everything he did. By 1903, the chief knew that LA would have to stop growing, or he would have to find a new source of water. His friend, Mayor Fred Eaton, told him of a great valley 200 miles to the north. For centuries, Paiutes had lived along the Owens River. White settlers who colonized Owens Valley found Paiutes irrigating natural grasses with several miles of small irrigation canals.
My grandmother told my oldest sister that when the whites came, they started to push the Indians up into the rocky places where the water was scarce because they wanted the other for their cattle and things. And they came in and they fenced everything up. They start saying, if you want to use my water, you have to have special permission. And the Indians always let the water run. It was never something that belonged to one individual person. It belonged to the whole community.
By 1904, settlers from New England, Switzerland, and Scotland had taken the Indians' land, established farms in a dozen towns, and a steamboat service on the age-old Owens Lake. They dug an elaborate irrigation system, diverting the Owens River into hundreds of miles of ditches. Former Mayor Fred Eaton convinced Mulholland to set out northward across the Mojave Desert in the fall of 1904 toward Owens Valley.
They went by buckboard, which was the only way you could go. It took them about 2 weeks to get there. I think there was a trail of whiskey bottles all the way out.
In 2 weeks, Mulholland and Eaton were on the banks of the Owens River.
At certain times of year, in wet years anyway, you can get a little glimpse of what the river must have been like then and how it must have impressed Mulholland. The Owens Valley is one of the most dramatic places in the world. You have on the one side the Sierra Nevada, virtually every mountain over 14,000 feet. And then you have a drop of 2 miles to the valley floor, and then a rise of almost 2 miles up to the White Mountain Range. Because the mountains stop virtually all weather, it is in the rain shadow, and there's no rain in the Owens Valley. It is a true desert, looking up onto huge snow-covered peaks. And through the middle of it comes what you almost could call a miniature Mississippi River, given the setting. It is so improbable in this harsh desert to see a river that used to be as engorged as the Owens. And not only was this a river that could take care of the next 20, 30, he probably imagined 50 years of population growth in LA, but that could flow all the way by gravity.
Oh, you know, when he saw the Owens River for the first time, he came back so full of enthusiasm. He says, you know, I've seen something here, water that'll last us into the next century.
And I think Mulholland suddenly must have changed. And he saw himself as a sort of builder of a Roman masterwork, as somebody who kept the great hydraulic engineering tradition alive. I can't tell you what went through his head, but suddenly he was a convert. Having been more of an efficiency guy and a conservationist, suddenly he became an empire builder, almost overnight. And now they were going to capture a river, the only river that kind of accidentally flowed through this desert, and they were going to move the whole river across this 200-plus miles of terrain that they had just covered at some risk probably to their lives.
The problem facing Mulholland was that the river was owned. All the water rights were owned by farmers who were irrigating something like 60,000 acres. This was a thriving agricultural area at the time, and it was being further developed by the Bureau of Reclamation. Now, how in the world were you going to wrest that water away from these farmers and the federal government? That was the dilemma.
Can you imagine today an American city acquiring an entire river for its future? Of course, it goes without saying. It couldn't be done, but it was done then.
Posing as agents for a federal project meant to irrigate Owens Valley, Mulholland's men went to the county courthouse. There they convinced clerks to show them deeds, maps, and records of stream flows. Within days, Eaton was quietly buying property and water rights. What ranchers did not know was that they were selling their water not to a local irrigation project, but to the city of Los Angeles. Without telling Mulholland, former Mayor Fred Eaton bought the only dam site in Owens Valley for himself.
Once the city knew who had the best water rights and who was likeliest to sell those rights, it was basically a done deal. It didn't take very long for them to capture most of that river.
Two people who would ultimately benefit and who knew the whole story of this scheme were the publishers of the Los Angeles Times, Harrison Gray Otis and Harry Chandler.
They were the big promoters and boosters, but they were sworn to secrecy as this was going on. They did not let the cat out of the bag until they couldn't help themselves. And finally, under a headline that said, "Titanic Project to Give the City a River," they talked about how the whole thing had gone. And, you know, I mean, when you read that today and imagine a major city newspaper just kind of gloating over the triumph of, you know, its artifice and chicanery, it makes you real in a sense. But that was what Los Angeles was like in those days. It was, the climate was one of just getting what you want any way you can get it.
The Owens Valley paper saw the future differently. The still-secret aqueduct route would pass through the San Fernando Valley on its way to LA, and someone was buying up near-worthless land in the San Fernando. Now, another cat out of the bag. It was a real estate syndicate that would make millions if Owens River water irrigated their newly acquired San Fernando Valley land.
What was happening all the while these water rights in the Owens Valley were being acquired was that the San Fernando Valley was being bought up by a syndicate of people who represented the power structure of Los Angeles with a kind of exquisite sense of proportion.
I suppose you could make a case for this being this incestuous cabal of this hidden, you know, Jonathan Club, California Club oligarchy, old boys, WASP network, no Jews, dogs, blacks, Mexicans allowed.
Quietly, the entire San Fernando Valley was bought up by the arch capitalists of Los Angeles for the purpose of irrigating it when the Owens River finally arrived, because Los Angeles wouldn't need all that water for a long time.
If water could be brought to the San Fernando from the Owens Valley, that rangy grassland, that semi-arid terrain could be turned into an absolute agricultural paradise, and there would be great fortunes made.
With all the cats out of all the bags, citizens would now vote on whether to pay for actually building the aqueduct. Mulholland campaigned with a vengeance. Opponents spread rumors that he was secretly dumping water at night to create a shortage. But in the middle of a drought, with the temperature climbing toward 105, the people of LA voted 10-1 to pay for Mulholland's aqueduct, to bring them the river they had just purchased.
I think one thing that gets overlooked when in discussing the aqueduct is that it was a popular move from the President of the United States down to the voters. in the city of Los Angeles. This was a highly approved project.
President Theodore Roosevelt, citing the greatest good for the greatest number, made Owens Valley off limits to further development by surrounding it with a national forest.
It suddenly became part of the Inyo National Forest, the only national forest in America with hardly any trees. The only trees were the orchard trees that were being irrigated and were about to die.
With the law and the president on his side, Mulholland set out in 1905 to build his aqueduct across the desert.
It was a great drama. It was a great epic drama, the building of that aqueduct. You had mule teams and you had men. They were working in desert heats, arid conditions. Water was a problem. Ironically enough, here on this giant water project, they had to worry about adequate water for the working stock and the men.
It can be almost freezing at night and then 110 degrees in the daytime, practically. Mulholland was there all the time.
Chief Engineer Mulholland had no formal training in civil engineering. He had, in fact, never graduated from grade school.
The automobile had barely been invented. Clipper ships were still sailing the seas. And this was an engineering project, the likes of which the world had really never seen before.
Mulholland ordered 12-foot steel pipe forged in Germany and shipped around the Horn. 100,000 men and women worked on the aqueduct, but never more than a few thousand at a time because the exhausting and dangerous work kept turnover so high. They had been farmhands, cowboys, and hard rock miners, but now they were city employees, civil servants like the chief himself. With no air conditioning, no refrigeration, no hard hats, in 110-degree heat, they crossed the Mojave in 5 years with a pipe big enough to hold a locomotive.
This was, an aqueduct that would have reached all the way across Massachusetts and then almost all the way back through a desert with mountains. What they were really building was the world's longest garden hose.
Surveyors said they could build the aqueduct simply by following the trail of whiskey bottles Mulholland and Eaton had thrown off the back of their buckboard in 1904. In the end, the chief and his lieutenants finished the job under budget and ahead of schedule. William Mulholland built his original aqueduct so well that to this day it still carries the Owens River to the people of Los Angeles.
The phrase Grandpa's aqueduct were among my first words. The day of the dedication of the aqueduct was, without a doubt, the high point of my grandfather's life.
A crowd of 30 to 40,000 Los Angelinos had gathered at the base of the spillway. There was a formal program, but once the water spilled down the cascade, the formal program was abandoned because thousands of people rushed with their tin cups to drink the water.
When the water came cascading down there, Mulholland, who was really exhausted at the time, gave what I think is the most concise dedication speech in history. He unfurled an American flag, he turned to the water, and he said, "There it is, take it."
Based on Mulholland's predictions, it was 4 times more water than Los Angeles could use.
oh so slow from Oh-So Parkway. If you're on the San Diego South at Magnolia, that accident cleared to the right shoulder. We're clear back to the Westminster Mall with bumper to bumper through the beach cities. And if you're going to be making your way on the 91 freeway...
That moment actually has to be seen not just in terms of human history, however brief human history is. It has to be seen in terms of geological time. Here you have, for the eons, an environment now being profoundly changed by the changing course of that river. And that water, in effect, created contemporary Los Angeles.
It's your earthquake damage repair and remodeling headquarters. This weekend,
Fly Sun Trips to Honolulu for only $199 plus tax round trip. Sun Trips, your pipeline to paradise. With Airwatch Traffic, I'm
At one of the big banquets in the city celebrating this great event, he made a speech and made the very interesting observation. He said, "We're doomed to success." Might be a motto for the city, don't you think?
When water came after 1913, it prepared for an absolute golden age of building and construction in Los Angeles that lasted through the 20s and through the 30s. At one point in the early 20s, there were some 67 lumber ships at the San Pedro Harbor lined up just waiting to get the wood off so they could keep the construction going. You also had the beginnings of the great Hollywood figures coming out. D.W. Griffith, Cecil B. DeMille coming just a few months after the water. At nowhere, as you move through Los Angeles, were you not in the presence of lawns, hedges, palm trees. Great palm trees which sway above Los Angeles now like nodding giraffes are taken as the signature of the city. Palm trees were not native to the region. They were planted by the hundreds and the hundreds in this era. Here you had a semi-arid region where coyotes roamed, where tumbleweed was blown by the wind, which in a very short time was turned into arguably the most exquisite invented garden in history. Now, if you link that with the adjacent citrus groves, which were still in full bloom in the teens and the 20s, I wasn't there, but it must have been wonderful.
You had a general sensibility of that time of turning the desert into an Eden.
Charlie Chaplin and Aldous Huxley came from England, William Faulkner from Mississippi, Frank Lloyd Wright from Wisconsin. Everyone came from everywhere. LA was suddenly growing 11 times faster than New York, faster even than Calcutta. 1 million people by 1922, of whom 31,000 were licensed real estate agents. Now, over Mulholland's objections, Los Angeles began annexing 52 surrounding communities. Soon, the city limits would cover 400 square miles, more than any city in America.
There'll be a lot of irate citizens when they find out that they're paying for water that they're not going to get.
Oh, that's all taken care of. See, Mr. Gitz, either you bring the water to L.A., or you bring L.A. to the water.
What he simply meant was that you would bring the water to where you wanted to bring it, and call that place L.A. and therefore, you could get Los Angeles taxpayers to pay what in effect were a cabal of real estate speculators to have the city pay millions of dollars for them to pump water down to land that was not in fact part of the city, and then cause them to vote that as part of the city, and thereby increase the value of that land which they had purchased and held 1,000-fold. So they were causing one city, in effect, to pay for them to develop another city and then say, well, it's really the same city.
As the Owens River was finally being relocated across a quarter of the state of California, it became immediately obvious that there was way more water than Los Angeles needed. And so, because the water was coming into the San Fernando Valley, it ended up irrigating the San Fernando Valley. It was basically an artificial imported river for agriculture there rather than the agriculture that had been essentially put out of business in the Owens Valley.
The syndicate's arid tracts in the San Fernando Valley blossomed into orange and lemon groves, peach orchards, fields of winter tomatoes. By 1920, LA County was the most productive farm county in America.
It may have been legal, but to move a whole river ostensibly for public good and end up making a bunch of capitalists even richer than they already were by giving them a brand new water supply was really a kind of a remarkable feat.
They're conning LA into building it, but the water's not going to go to LA. It's coming right here.
What?
Everything you can see, everything around us. I was at the Hall of Records today.
The original title for Chinatown, I actually was going to call it Water and Power. Because, that's what it came. And water was power. It was money. And those who knew how to manipulate it, much more adroitly than anybody could ever manipulate a stock market, could make money off of it. And you could see it. It was a palpable thing running through your movie. Just a river of greed.
You have any idea what this land would be worth with a steady water supply? About 30 million more than they paid for it.
The syndicate began plowing under their newly developed San Fernando orange groves for tract homes, advance guard of the largest subdivision in history. The value of their land had gone up tenfold.
This is a great age of salesmanship, because these were masters of the art of encouraging people to envision on an empty hillside the great cities, the towns, the schools, the churches, the synagogues, which would one day be there had they but the faith that the salesman had. Owning your own home in this region was given an almost quasi-religious value, that your children would not be delinquent if you had a home, that your marriage would be happy. But many of the ills of our society were due to the fact that people lived in cities and rented.
Mulholland himself did not profit directly from the syndicate's dealings, but he was now the highest paid public employee in California. The University of California gave an honorary degree to Dr. Mulholland, the penniless immigrant who never finished grade school but could keep the entire LA water system in his head. LA now had a Mulholland School, Mulholland Dam, Mulholland Reservoir, and named its new winding scenic drive the Mulholland Highway.
Every kid in LA it's one of the first names you learn when you hit when you're old enough to get a junior operator's license, because that's where you parked your car to make out, So that's one's association with Mulholland. That's where you took your girl.
The men in the family, that was a staple of conversation, waterworks. There was always a dodge to get the family to go out. It was usually either to see the wildflowers in the spring, but it somehow always ended up that we were standing in front of some big turbine or waterworks, and with the men discussing all of this the way, I'd discuss Impressionist paintings with a friend at the county museum.
The city, which never had a reason to be, now had 1,000 oil wells, its own automobile and airplane factories. And before long, 90% of all the world's movies would be made in LA. The imported Owens River allowed the city to expand at 3 times the rate Mulholland had used in his aqueduct calculations.
He wasn't a prophet. He couldn't foresee that LA would grow the way it did. And that's what upset a lot of the balance.
A citizens committee tried to nominate William Mulholland for mayor. He said he would rather give birth to a porcupine backward than be mayor of Los Angeles.
It was a scramble. I mean, the city kept growing, and the Chamber of Commerce kept booming, and there were all these marvelous come-ons from to the railroad companies and from the Chamber of Commerce. And he used to joke and say that he thought the only thing that could stop L.A. from growing was to kill Frank Wiggins. And Frank Wiggins was the president of the Chamber of Commerce, who spent his lifetime booming L.A. all over the country and encouraging more people. And so it was a little bit like the Sorcerer's Apprentice. You start the process going, and you've got to have more water, more water, more water. And you, the father of the city's water system, are supposed to continue to provide this water. It's a terrible place to be. And you've got to be ingenious and inventive and come up with new ideas for getting water.
Now there were 60,000 realtors. The Chamber of Commerce sent millions of promotional brochures to the Midwest and New England, to Guatemala City and Paris. Only 10 years after Mulholland finished his great aqueduct with a fourfold surplus, LA was running out of water, and he was pondering new sources: the Colorado, Mono Lake, or the Sierras.
Maybe the best example of the metamorphosis of Mulholland into an obsessive water seeker was described to me by Horace Albright, who was, back in the 20s, the superintendent at Yosemite National Park. And he was at a banquet table with Mulholland, and Mulholland started waxing eloquent about how beautiful the valley is, and then said what he would do if he were in charge is he would send photographers into the valley and let them photograph all day long, all night, every season, and just have the most astounding collection of Yosemite photographs that you could ever imagine. Put them in books and send them free to every library in the world. And then he would go in there and build a great big dam and stop the goddamned waste.
Just to the north of Yosemite lay John Muir's beloved Hetch Hetchy Valley. Here, LA's rival, San Francisco, was in fact planning a dam, which would soon permanently submerge Hetch Hetchy under 300 feet of water. Owens Valley had in fact gotten off easy compared to Hetch Hetchy. Mulholland's aqueduct had only dewatered the southern half of the valley, leaving the northern towns and farms to flourish during World War I.
Well, Owens Valley was an absolute, you might say, show place. It produced fruit that people from L.A. would go nuts over to get this fruit from here. I can remember when the sky would get black with flights of duck. This was one of the major flyways. Oh, absolutely black with them. I mean that. The sky would be black, and even for a day or two, or for hours and hours.
It was a great time to live up here. It was a very close-knit community, you know. Every Saturday night, they'd keep the Opera House open all night, and they'd show the movie. When the movie was over, they'd push the chairs back, and everybody danced all night. Then they'd have a breakfast, and everybody go home back to the ranches at sunup, you know. Did this every Saturday night, and it was a great time to live in the Owens Valley.
What few people knew was that William Mulholland was about to turn his attention to what remained of the Owens River.
This growing city of Los Angeles becomes like a vampire, making a direct connection to the major artery of the Owens Valley, which is the Owens River. And of course, imagine those ranchers who were initially told that Los Angeles would be their partner, their friend, that they would grow in prosperity along with the city, began to see that the vampire was sucking the lifeblood and that their fertile fields were becoming parched and non-productive.
In the wet years since 1905, relations between the city and the valley had been surprisingly cordial, but now there was drought. The city sunk 52 turbine wells into the valley floor to pump groundwater into the aqueduct, crippling surrounding ranches.
What people resented here, they didn't have the option, they didn't have a choice, and the pressure that it built over 20 years and the way it was done, and it's all water we're talking about. They could care nothing about this property.
On Sunday, my mother would take me for drives, and she would always talk about apple orchards and peach orchards. And it wasn't until years later that I realized, because growing up in Bishop, we were surrounded by sagebrush. It was always dry. It was always dusty. There was always dust in the air. And I couldn't even imagine what my mother was talking about. I couldn't imagine. And it took me until a young adult to realize that it was much different at one time. I would have liked to have seen what my grandparents saw there. I'd like to see the green. I'd like to see the orchards. It must have been gorgeous. It must have been gorgeous. I mean, I think that the Owens Valley is beautiful now. I grew up there. And it's beautiful now. So can you imagine what it was like when my grandfather was there, when my great-grandfather was there? It could make me cry.
Anger mounted as Mulholland's men cut ranchers' canals. The city bought more land, siphoned off more and more water. Half the crops were gone by 1924. Schools and businesses began to close. Owens Lake went bone dry. Rumors of resistance began to fly. Someone blew a hole in the siphon. And then, just before Thanksgiving in 1924, the local bank president and 100 citizens seized the aqueduct. They opened the floodgates and sent the entire flow of the Owens River down a ditch and back into its ancient channel on the valley floor.
They organized a caravan of old Model Ts that drove, I think, probably dozens of cars down to the Alabama gates on the aqueduct, where there was a turnout valve where they could basically stop the flow of water to Los Angeles.
Talk about community involvement. I know that my grandfather was there. I have spoken recently with my mother's cousin, and she said that she remembers that it was a party, that her mother got her up early and got her dressed up, and she was only 4. So there was that was a great step. And those people didn't move from the Alabama gates. They didn't move. That took a lot of courage. It did.
There wasn't any guns involved. There wasn't that type of thing. There had only been a watchman there, and he was sympathetic to the natives, if you will. So there was a whole bunch of arbitration, but discussion, but interest focused on this thing is mainly what they were after.
The crowd grew to 700, picnicking, singing Onward Christian Soldiers, playing Enrico Caruso on a hand-cranked phonograph. Superintendent Mulholland sent city police to take back the water, but the local sheriff stood between the officers and the citizens.
This news did travel around the world. This was a great big story at the time. And it was embarrassing to Los Angeles because they were being cast as the villain. And, you know, it was hard to see them any other way.
Mulholland saw this as, number one, an instance of civil insurrection, but saw that nothing less than the survival of Los Angeles itself was at stake, and that basically there had to be a cleansing of farmers from that region, that the two communities were incompatible, and that they would have to be bought out.
And so they decided to try to sit down with some of the leaders of the Owens Valley and negotiate some kind of a settlement.
After a week, the local bank president told the raiders that a Los Angeles consortium would negotiate a fair price for the remaining water rights in Owens Valley. LA would even consider sharing the water. With cheers and congratulations, the ranchers and their families went home, only to learn later that the deal had fallen through.
As these negotiations, such as they were, are going on, the city is busily buying more rights, land and water rights in the valley, basically buying the whole place up.
While ranchers occupied the aqueduct, city agents had secured legal options on virtually all remaining land and water rights in Owens Valley. They bought whole towns, even the county seat and county jail.
More trouble, and it's not the first time either. The last bombing was 4 years ago, and ranchers objecting to the city's cutting across their property are suspected. It's one of the mainline pipes about 150 miles north of Los Angeles that supplies water to the big town. It's lucky Los Angeles has an emergency watershed, or this might have resulted in a terrible drought disaster. The police are after the fiends who did this rotten job. Let's hope they get them. There's no punishment too strong for them.
He received a phone call, and this is like telling Leonardo da Vinci that someone's just slashed the Mona Lisa. I mean, he was just appalled, outraged, and furious. And at that point, a certain ugly turn of events occurred. The mood changed.
Now, night after night, saboteurs dynamited Mulholland's masterwork, the great aqueduct on which 1 million people depended.
We had numerous stories about my grandfather taking off and blowing up, dynamiting the aqueduct. Took great pride in the fact of the many raids to blow up the aqueduct.
They would go along and dynamite sections, and then they'd go right off back up into the hills. Would camp out for weeks and weeks and weeks. After they had bombed it, they were afraid to come home, and how their wives and kids had to basically hold family and fort together.
The city named 3 women and 15 men as ringleaders, but could never win a single conviction.
They were heroes, you know, in your own mind. You know, those guys were great for what they did and everything, but we always thought that we'd wish we'd been there if we were kids, you know, but...
Interestingly enough, then he went on to be a California state senator. So he wasn't a crazy man. He was just a man on a mission and a purpose.
Mulholland and his colleagues said, look, this can't go on. You're threatening the water supply for a great city, and this is criminal. And they sent machine guns up there, and it stopped.
Trainloads of them were going up to the Owens Valley and basically imposing martial law. There were searchlights and floodlights up and down that valley, sweeping across the aqueduct all night long.
Mulholland sent 600 heavily armed police to secure the city's water supply, backed by the full force of state and federal law endorsed by the Chamber of Commerce.
As Jean Renoir said, everyone has his reasons. And I'm sure he had his reasons, and he justified it because he had to. I can see how it would have been very easy to get carried away by powerful men saying, see what you can do for the city, you know? What a great man he'll be. You know.
When I was a kid, you know, he was a bad guy. He was the guy with the black hat. We all hated him, you know, and we all talked about him a lot. We know what an evil guy he was, but he had a fantastic vision, but he didn't care who he stepped over to get it. He didn't care what happened to the Owens Valley.
I would say that when I was a little girl, it was not good to be a Mulholland in Owens Valley, and I was never taken there. And my folks, if they should chance to travel, my mother told me they always registered at a hotel using her maiden name, because we were just not well liked in Owens Valley, and it was not a good name to carry.
Well, Mulholland was a very honest man, because he said that everyone in Bishop was a son of a bitch, and that there wasn't enough pine trees to hang the natives on, which they deserved. Whereas the rest of them, they went with a protocol and with devitation and so on, but not Mulholland.
He knew that it was a vain hope, I mean, to think that they could go back. I mean, the water had been taken. It was a fait accompli. There was no turning back. Owens Valley was not going to be reverted back to what it had been in 1905. That deed had been done.
Somebody did put up a sign then that said Los Angeles city limits, way out in the Owens Valley, as a kind of a bitter joke. It was really then that everyone knew William Mulholland had triumphed. He had won. The valley was really his.
Before long, city bulldozers began knocking down farmhouses and filling in irrigation ditches.
Well, first we had the valley. Then the settlers came in and took it away from us. Then the city of Los Angeles came in there and took it away from them.
All Mulholland needed now was a place to store water for the growing city. But former LA Mayor Fred Eaton owned the only reservoir site in Owens Valley and was demanding $1 million for it. So Mulholland built a huge dam in the hills just 40 miles from downtown LA. It was the largest arch support dam in North America, the final link in a decade of triumph. By the spring of '28, the reservoir in San Francisco Canyon was full to the brim with a year's supply of Owens River water, far from the scene of battle. On March 12th, workers noticed a small leak on the north side. Mulholland inspected the leak, pronounced the dam sound, and went home to bed.
My grandfather was awakened from his sleep with a phone call saying the dam had gone out. And his first response as he stumbled toward the phone was, "Oh, please, God, don't let people be killed."
There was no warning. There was no warning system. And it started wiping out whole communities. You had so much water in that dam that there were 1,000-ton blocks of concrete riding the crest. It was not water at a certain point. It was trees, homes, blocks of concrete, rocks, rubble. It was a semi-solid wall advancing at 20 or 30 miles an hour, 40, 50, 60 feet high. You couldn't run from it.
I was 5 years old when the St. Francis Dam broke. And with my limited perceptions, I realized some dreadful thing. It was like bringing a dark curtain down over a lighted area. My father took me, my father was stunned, and he took me in the car. My mother was not well at the time. And we drove up to the dam site. And on the way up, he taught me how to say San Francisco Canyon. And we rehearsed it over and over as if it were some kind of a catechism lesson. And what it did for me was imprint that name forever in my mind as a scene of some terrible fate which had befallen our family.
Mulholland surveyed the greatest man-made disaster in California history. His St. Francis Dam had killed as many people as the San Francisco earthquake.
I've always been moved all my life at the pictures that were taken of him the morning that he went up and surveyed the ruins of the dam failure. It's like looking at the most stricken human being I have ever seen. It's a dead, stark look on his face as he stands amid the rubble of something he had created. It was an engineer's most horrible fate any engineer could have, to build a structure that fails and also kills.
Well, Mulholland was in a state of shock. He made an initial effort, really, it wasn't much of an effort, to blame the whole thing on dynamiters, which was the term he now used generically to refer to anybody in the Owens Valley. But it was soon very obvious that the dam had failed by itself, and nobody had sabotaged it, and that Mulholland had paid a visit to the dam just hours earlier and said the dam was fine. So his reputation, which he had been a god figure in Los Angeles.
Mulholland went from being the father of the city, the founder of the city, to standing possible indictment.
The precise cause was never found. No criminal charges were ever filed, but the coroner's jury held William Mulholland responsible. He accepted the blame, broke down in sobs, and said that he envied the dead.
They kept slowly taking away the water from the canals and the ditches and everything, and slowly but surely, they got everything siphoned down. And so the land, the trees, and the old farmsteads, they all died off, and all the old orchard died off, and they're all gone, and all the houses are all gone. So they just turned it back into the desert that it was, basically.
When we traveled to Los Angeles, we'd watch the aqueduct. My parents would always say, "There's our water. Girls, that water came from the Owens Valley." And as a child, I remember feeling animosity towards Los Angeles. You always knew, you always felt they took our water.
Mulholland resigned in disgrace, his real achievements clouded by the disaster and by the suffering in Owens Valley. His plans for still greater aqueducts lay on the drawing board, but to the people of L.A., he was an embarrassment. Officials began referring to the Mulholland Reservoir as the Hollywood Reservoir. Owens Valley was history, but fantasy and folklore lived on. The myth of rampaging bullies destroying a paradise, gallant ranchers defending their homes.
These gentlemen bring word from the Capitol. The New Oak Valley has been condemned.
Condemned? What do you mean?
It seems that Metropole City needs more water and power. So the state has decided to build a dam across Cutstone Canyon and turn the valley into a reservoir.
Just let him start trying to build a dam around here.
The state authorized me to build a dam. And it's going to be built whether you like it or not.
Take it easy. You don't know the kind of people you're dealing with, mister.
But he'll find out.
In 1934, using Mulholland's original plans, the Metropolitan Water District blasted a new aqueduct all the way to the Arizona state line, to its second river, the Colorado.
Unless we take immediate steps to bring in water from an outside source, the people of Southern California will be up against a serious water shortage. But we're fortunate in having within our reach a water source capable of supplying our needs. This source is the Colorado River.
The governor of Arizona deployed his state militia to the river's bank to stop Los Angeles from taking Colorado River water. It was to no avail. Final resolution would not come until 30 years later, after one of the longest court cases in American history.
On the day when the waters of the Colorado River rushed through this aqueduct, the greatest engineering feat of its kind ever accomplished will take its place among the wonders of the world.
It is a wonderful thing to contemplate this new conquest of the great Southwest, where everything that man desires is present, everything except sufficient water. With sufficient water, we can be assured of a great and a stable civilization.
Wow, what a day. I'm afraid we're going to be busy.
Hi, Greg. It was a high-speed pursuit earlier this morning. They have the San Bernardino westbound on and off ramps at Atlantic closed down because of a police investigation. Bumper to Puente.
Buenos días, amigos. Aquí estamos en nuestro traficóptero 1540 y en estos momentos hemos visto que...
Llega a Los Ángeles en 11 horas.
On behalf of MCA, we'd like to welcome you all aboard the Universal Studios Hollywood Supertram presented by Texaco. Oh, yeah. Uh-oh, I think I hear something that might get a little bit wet. It's a flash flood! Cowabunga! Hey, watch out for that tree back there!
He brought enough elements together, water, population, wealth, so that Los Angeles was now almost condemned to grow and grow and grow. So after the 1920s, Los Angeles's history is almost defined by an obsessive, constant search for more and more water. Hoover Dam was authorized in 1928, finished by the mid-30s. Then Mono Lake, which is north of the Owens Valley, was hooked up to the aqueduct and began draining all the streams that feed this irreplaceable natural wonder out there.
Mulholland had long had his eye on Mono Lake, 100 miles north of Owens Valley. In 1936, his successors dusted off his plans and pushed the aqueduct north to Mono, seeking again the greatest good for the greatest number.
People really shouldn't have any problem with our water system and take it for granted, or the water people aren't doing their job well. I always felt that I was working for a good purpose. I wasn't doing something that, in my view, really didn't basically benefit society. I felt that I was working on something that was a fundamental benefit to society. I was proud of that.
The people of LA could now depend on water from ancient streams feeding Mono Lake.
This is the desert. This is the grim, waterless waste that covered most of Los Angeles, even within the memory of living men. Here, between the mountains and the sea, Los Angeles was built. Here is living, breathing proof that energy and vision can build a metropolis almost overnight. Angelinos are likely to live on a ranch, still within city limits. Perhaps a few years ago, they were residents of Iowa, Illinois, and New Jersey. Here, they quickly abandon old conventions of living, dress as they please, make the most of their mild, seductive climate. A thrilling introduction to this promised land of exotic people, sunshine, stucco, money, optimism. Success is her pattern. This is L.A. This is America.
The rise of Nazis in Germany and the fleeing of all that talent, you had the creation of a Euro-Southern California. Otto Preminger, who was, of course, fleeing the Nazis, was at the Hillcrest Country Club, and people were playing cards, and people were talking, and the two people started talking in Hungarian. And they were talking away in Hungarian. Otto Preminger said, "What's the matter?" He says, "Why are you talking in Hungarian?" He says, "This is Los Angeles." He said, "Talk German."
From Berlin, New York, Alabama, from all over the world, people flooded into Southern California. They said it was just like everywhere else, only more so.
They were living in paradise. It's something like love and good health. You really miss it by its absence very often. I mean, just wasn't aware, was never aware growing up, but how wonderful it was until it was gone, and that was the air itself. The air was wonderful. If you stop and think about the mean temperature of the climate here year-round, it's probably the most perfect climate to, sort of walk around in with almost no clothing, because the air, you just feel that it's almost an extension of your own skin. It's not too hot, it's not too cold.
The machinery of water acquisition overworked the Owens River, the Colorado, and the Mono Basin. In 1964, the Metropolitan Water District proposed diverting the Columbia River to Southern California. The future had arrived.
Somebody finally decided, rather than just go after another source of water every 10 or 20 years, why don't we go to where there's so much water, we'll have enough for 200 years. And where was that place? Alaska. It would have brought this water down in huge jolts, irrigated Nevada, irrigated Eastern Oregon on the way. Some of it would have gone all the way to Mexico. It was going to go to Arizona. It was going to go to Texas. Nobody really blinked. There were lots of people in the business who thought, well, yeah, it's maybe a little premature, but this is going to happen someday because it has to.
This is not a mirage, but rather a preview of an atomic marvel of tomorrow, a milestone in man's development. A nuclear-powered agro-industrial complex with a nuclear reactor as the energy source and a desalting plant as the fresh water source. The desert may be transformed into a nuclear-powered agro-industrial complex.
There were plans to lasso, icebergs and tow them down. It was like the flim-flam, man. I mean, there was no end to these people who had plans to dam San Francisco Bay, to pipelines beyond your wildest dreams. When this wasn't about carrying oil, this was about carrying water. This is water.
When these reactors are coupled to a desalting plant, approximately 1 billion gallons of fresh water will be produced per day.
Of course, at the time, nobody was challenging the idea of using 8 gallons of water per flush in a toilet, or irrigating your lawn to the point where it's standing an inch deep in water. Nobody thought about conservation. People only thought about supply.
The city had long since exhausted supply from the tiny Los Angeles River and cemented over its channel by 1960. The DWP built a reservoir to store a supply of Owens River water near the center of Los Angeles.
The Los Angeles City Police helicopter is here. The Los Angeles City Fire Department helicopter is here. The police are on the ground with motorcycles and automobiles trying to effectively activate people from here so there can't possibly be any more loss of life than there is. Property, no telling how much property has already been lost.
A triangle-shaped wedge tears out of the asphalt and concrete-lined wall of the earth-filled dam of the Baldwin Hills Reservoir, and millions of gallons of water race down the canyon toward the homes below, in the community between downtown Los Angeles and International Airport. Almost 300 million gallons of water in 77 minutes, an incredible disaster.
The Department of Water and Power had no choice but to carry on, since it now served 3 million people. In 1966, LA acquired its third river. Like a giant version of Mulholland's Owens Valley project, the California State Aqueduct now brought the Feather River from 600 miles north, enough water to fill the Rose Bowl every 90 minutes.
Los Angeles, by the 70s, was reaching 200 miles in one direction, 250 miles in another direction, and 600 miles in a third direction for water. And it still wasn't enough.
In 1970, the Department of Water and Power, using Mulholland's original sketches, finished the second barrel, a parallel aqueduct not far from the original, sucking now twice as much water from Mono Lake. The million-year-old lake now fell 2 feet every year. It was the only stop for 1 million migrating seabirds on their way from the Arctic to Bolivia.
We could see the lake going down and down and down, and pretty soon there wasn't anything growing around the lake anymore. Everything was drying up, all the little springs were dying. You know, that was really, really devastating, because we thought the whole lake is going to be like this. And when you think of God's given lake, you think it should be like it was.
The local people had already resigned themselves to the fact that the lake was going to dry up or get to a very small level, just because of the adversary. Department of Water and Power is too big to fight. It was not anything that anybody could do.
Great alkali dust storms began boiling up off the exposed shores of Mono and the dry bed of Owens Lake. By 1974, Owens Valley, the Switzerland of America, had the worst particulate pollution in the country.
The sense that somehow LA had sinned against another people became a central imagery in this whole water story, and one that I've always had a lot of trouble with, because I've always sympathized with the underdog, but at the same time I've been proud of my grandfather, so it's given me a great deal of conflict to have to come to terms with that.
Why are you doing it? How much better can you eat? What can you buy that you can't already afford?
The future, Mr. Gitz. The future.
And the crimes that are committed in the name of the future, against the future, is really the history of water in California, here in LA. I mean, it's just the supreme irony.
See, Mr. Gitz, most people never have to face the fact. At the right time and the right place, they're capable of anything.
Some crimes are so monstrous that they can't figure out how to punish them, so they actually sort of reward them. And Mulholland's name is on the scenic route of the city, and the criminals' names are on plaques as city founders, rather than in jail where they belonged.
I think a movie like Chinatown is an easy out. It oversimplifies, it's melodramatic, it's not true. I mean, literally not true. But it provides a rather easy explanation of events. And for people who like to bash LA, it's perfect. New York Times loves to hold it up as a piece of history.
The movie Chinatown was bad, contorted history, but it was powerful myth, rekindling violence against the Department of Water and Power, now headquartered in a building that cost as much as Mulholland's original aqueduct.
There was violence here before, a long time ago. Back in 1924, angry farmers and ranchers lined the wall, armed with shotguns and rifles. They blew holes in the aqueduct 17 times. This year, it took this form, a dynamite blast at the gates of the first aqueduct. The water for Los Angeles stopped briefly. Instead,
resistance was futile. The Department of Water and Power by now had more manpower than the population of Bishop, more, in fact, than the entire population of Owens Valley. But this time, something had changed. David Gaines, a young biologist from LA and a dozen University of California students, had begun a careful study of Mono Lake's singular ecosystem. They found it on the brink of collapse.
We knew about Owens Lake, of course. Now it's just a dry ditch, 100 miles to the south. And we realized that Mono Lake could look like that someday. And once we realized what was here, that all that would be lost, we couldn't let it just go down without making some effort to save it.
By 1976, Mono Lake had fallen 40 feet, exposing mineral towers which had formed underwater over the ages. It had become 3 times saltier than the ocean.
What we are asking, what Mono Lake is asking all of us is, where are we going to draw the line? If we don't share some water with Mono Lake, what will be next? Will it be Lake Tahoe? Will it be the Eel River, the Yukon? Will it be on and on until the last of our singing rivers and beautiful lakes are gone because we've taken every last drop? We've watched the last waterfowl and the last salmon follow the California state emblem, the California grizzly, into oblivion. It is a battleground in that sense. It's asking us, how much are we going to share with the earth?
Well, it was very primitive. I mean, there was 12 people, only 1 or 2 cars. Everybody else did their research via bicycle. They'd take their binoculars and their backpack and their lunch, and they'd hop on their bikes, and they'd ride down the dirt roads and dump their bikes and hike out for a couple miles. And they'd walk through mud, and, they were really the quintessential researchers out there braving the elements.
All those college boys come over, they all want to look like professors, and got big beards, And so Mr. Gaines, he was one of them, and he looked just like the rest of them, kind of like a hippie, I'd say. But I don't want to say he wasn't a hippie, but he looked that way. But he was pretty smart, that guy. He'd started things going here.
When I grew up in Los Angeles, I never learned where water came from. And it was only after doing some complex calculations that we learned that if diversions continue, this lake will fall another 40 to 60 vertical feet. What we will be left with is an alkali wasteland, a sterile chemical sump, where there is now one of the most beautiful and life-productive places on Earth.
Far more than natural beauty was threatened at Mono Lake.
What was at stake was a big aquatic ecosystem that was very simple but very productive. I mean, the numbers are astronomical. You've got algae, and then the brine shrimp eat the algae, and then you've got millions of birds coming every summer to eat the brine flies and the brine shrimps. A far-off dream was out there, but I don't think we gazed up at it too much. It might be too discouraging. I mean, to have a handful of biologists fighting the Department of Water and Power of the City of Los Angeles with a multi-million-dollar budget was too big of a contrast.
When William Mulholland took water from Owens Valley and Mono Lake years before, no one questioned the damage to nature. But an environmental movement had come of age in America, along with powerful new laws and a great shift in public opinion. Committees at Mono Lake and Owens Valley, together with the Audubon Society, went to court to stop the water conquest Mulholland had set in motion in 1905.
If you're angry and have nothing else, no other recourse, I think dynamite comes to mind. And they were ranchers. They understood dynamite. We were college biologists. No experience with dynamite. We knew facts and figures, and we knew that we could, we're educated people, and we could probably figure out how to find lobbyists to help us in Sacramento, and how to find lawyers. People were saying, well, ask for a lot, go way high, and then you compromise down with the politicians and the agencies. And we were all biologists, and we kind of said, that doesn't sound right. Why can't we just start with what we know is the truth and just stay there forever? And that's what we did.
The courts ruled that drying out the Owens River or streams feeding Mono Lake was not in the public interest. In 1988, the state forced the city to return water to Mono for the first time in half a century. Los Angeles began water conservation on a scale never before seen in America, and now shares the water in a fragile peace with Owens Valley and Mono Lake.
One local person said, if you guys save the lake, I'll eat my hat. It turns out that we've saved the lake, and we have the regulations, and people seem much happier. You see water running down the creek, fish in the creek. Maybe some of them remember the great numbers of ducks and geese that were down at the lake, and they look forward to that being in the future again.
I didn't think that they would succeed in persuading the city of Los Angeles to let the water in again.
Why did you think that they would not succeed?
Well, how can you fight the city of Los Angeles? So really, this was a victory, a great victory.
David Gaines did not live to see the victory. He had died a year before in an automobile accident not far from Mono Lake.
And so finally, the machine that Mulholland had set in motion just kind of began to fall apart. The whole posture of the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power and the city changed. The city negotiated with Mono Lake folks and decided to give more water back to the lake. It gave up on the idea of importing Klamath River water or Columbia River water. I think ultimately it was people's feeling, why bring more water in if it just encourages more growth that forces us to bring more water in? You know, it's a sort of a death vortex. It's the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland, running faster and faster just to stay in place. And that mentality has sort of died a respectful death. And, you know, if there's an occasional shortage, well, that's too bad. We're in a desert here, and we're not supposed to be like Miami all the time, every day of the year, to infinity.
After the dam failure, my grandfather underwent the most profound change that you can imagine, but he had been a vigorous, functioning 70-year-old man or 72-year-old man at the time the dam failed. And he simply shriveled. He'd come out to the ranch and he'd sit in the living room with his cigar, and the conversation would go around, and he would just shut his eyes. He would sit there like some kind of a sleeping giant. I was so struck as a child when I attended the funeral, and his body lay in state in City Hall. And the working men who came to pay their last respects to him, and some of them cried. And when I was 12 years old, and that made a big impression on me because I had never seen grown men cry. And so I derived from that this was a man who had commanded a lot of love and respect in his day. And I've spent a lifetime trying to jibe that with all the attacks that have been made on him by people who didn't know him.
Freeways are settling down, believe it or not. We checked on the 405 and the 101 leaving the Hollywood Hills. Not bad at all. No need to take alternate routes such as Laurel Canyon, Coldwater Canyon, or even Mulholland Drive. I'm Dr. Roadmap flying for Captain Jorge in Jetcopter 790.
This is PBS.